Chapter 4 of Famous Sea Fights by John R. Hale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. Famous Sea Fights by John R. Hale. Chapter 4 Sluys 1340. The gold nobles of the coinage of King Edward III show in conventional fashion the king standing in the waist of a ship with a high bow and poop, the red cross banner of St. George at the stern, and the lions of England and the lilies of France emblazoned on his shield. The device typifies his claim to the sovereignty of the narrow seas between England and the continent, the prize won for him by the fleet that conquered at Sluys. Sluys is often spoken of as the sea fight that inaugurated the long victorious career of the British Navy. It would be more correct to say that it was the battle which, by giving King Edward the command of the Channel, made his successful invasion of France possible, and secured for England the possession of Calais. Holding both Dover and Calais, the English for 2 centuries were masters of the narrow sea gate through which all the trade between northern Europe and the rest of the world had to pass. They had the power of bringing severe pressure to bear upon the German cities of the Hansa League, the traders of the Low Countries, the merchants of Spain, Genoa, and Venice, by their control of this all-important waterway. Hence the claim upheld till the 17th century that the King of England was sovereign of the seas, and that in the Channel and the North Sea every foreign ship had to lower her sails and salute any English king's ship that she met. Sluys, which had such far-reaching consequences, was not the first of English naval victories. Alfred the Great maintained in the latter part of his reign a fleet of small ships to guard the coasts against the Norse and Danish pirates, and this won him the name of founder of the British Navy. But for centuries after there was no attempt at forming or keeping up a regular naval establishment. Alfred's navy must have been dispersed under his weaker successors, for the Northmen never found any serious obstacles to their raids. Harold had no navy, and the result was that in a single 12-month England was twice invaded, first by Harold Hardrada and Tostig, who were beaten at Stamford Bridge, and then by William the Norman, who conquered at Hastings. But even the conqueror had no fighting fleet. His ships were used merely to ferry his army across the Channel, and he made no attempt to use them against the Northmen who harried the east coast. The record of victory begins with the reign of King John, when in 1213 William Longsword, his half-brother, with a fleet gathered from the shipping of Dover and the southeastern ports, destroyed a French fleet that had assembled on the coast of the Netherlands to transport an invading army to England. Damme, that is, the dams or embankments to keep out the sea, was then a fortified port. It is now a Dutch village some miles from the coast, in the midst of green meadows won from the sea, with roads shaded by avenues of trees, and only the traffic of its canal to remind it that it once had a harbour. 4 years later, Hubert de Burgh, governor of Dover Castle, defeated another attempted raid on England by improvising a fleet and attacking the French squadron in the Straits. De Burgh got to windward of the French, then sailed down on them, grappled and boarded them. There was an incident which happily we do not hear of again in naval warfare. As the English scrambled on board of the French ships, they threw quicklime in the eyes of their opponents. It was no doubt an ugly trick of piratical fighting, for in those days when there was no police of the seas, there was a certain amount of piracy and smuggling carried on by the men of Dover and the Cinque Ports. Just as for lack of police protection highway robbery was a danger of travel by road, so till organized naval power had developed there was a good deal of piracy in the European seas, and peaceful traders sailed in large fleets for mutual protection, just as travelers on land took care to have companions for a journey. The Channel was also enlivened by occasional fights for fishing grounds between fleets of fishing craft, and the quicklime trick of Hubert de Burgh's battle was probably one of the methods of this irregular warfare. Edward I had a navy which did useful service by coasting northward, as his armies marched into Scotland, and securing for them regular supplies and reinforcements by sea. Under his weak successor the sea was neglected, and it was the third Edward who used the navy effectually to secure that his quarrel with France should be fought out not on English ground but on the Continent, and thus became the founder of the sea power of England. There was no royal navy in the modern sense of the term. When the king went to war his fleet was recruited from three different sources. The warship was a merchantman, on board of which a number of fighting men, knights, men-at-arms, archers and billmen were embarked. These were more numerous than the crew of sailors which navigated the ship, for the largest vessels of the time were not of more than 200 to 300 tons, and as oars were not used in the rough seas of the Channel, and there was only one mast with a single square sail, and perhaps a jib foresail, the necessary hands for sailing her were few. There was a dual command, the knight or noble who led the fighting men being no sailor, and having a pilot under him who commanded the sailors and navigated the ship. This dual arrangement, which we have seen at work in the fleets of more ancient days, left its traces in our navy up to the middle of the 19th century, when ships of the Royal Navy still had, besides the captain, a sailing master among their officers. The king owned a small number of ships, which he maintained, just as he kept a number of knights in his pay to form his personal retinue on land. During peace he hired these ships out to merchants, and when he called them back for war service he took the crews that navigated them into his pay and sent his fighting men on board. But the king's ships were the least numerous element in the war fleet. Merchantmen were impressed for service from London and the other maritime towns and cities, the feudal levy providing the fighting complement. A third element in the fleet was obtained from the Cinque Ports. There were really 7, not 5 of them: Dover, Hythe, Hastings, Winchelsea, Rye, Romney, and Sandwich. Under their charter they enjoyed valuable privileges, in return for which they were bound to provide, when the king called upon them, 57 ships and 1200 men and boys for 15 days at their own expense, and as long after as the king paid the necessary charges. The naming of so short a term of service shows that maritime operations were expected not to last long. It was, indeed, a difficult matter to keep a medieval fleet at sea, and the conditions that produced this state of things lasted far into the modern period. Small ships, crowded with fighting men, had no room for any large store of provisions and water. When the first scanty supply was exhausted, unless they were in close touch with a friendly port, they had to be accompanied by a crowd of store ships, and as the best merchantmen would naturally have been impressed for the actual fighting, these would be small, inferior, and less seaworthy ships, and the fleet would have to pay as much attention to guarding its convoy as to operating against an enemy. No wonder that as a rule the most that could be attempted was a short voyage and a single stroke. It was in 1340 that King Edward III challenged the title of Philip of Valois to the crown of France, and by claiming it for himself began the 100 Years' War. Both sides to the quarrel began to collect fleets and armies, and both realized that the first struggle would be on the sea. It would be thus decided whether the war was to be fought out on French or on English ground. The French king collected ships from his ports and strengthened his fleet by hiring a number of large warships from Genoa, then one of the great maritime republics of the Mediterranean. The Genoese sailors knew the northern seas, for there were always some of their ships in the great trading fleet that passed up the Channel each spring, bringing the produce of the Mediterranean countries and the East to the northern ports of Europe, and returned in the late summer laden with the merchandise of the Hansa traders. Early in the year King Philip had assembled 190 ships, large and small, French and Genoese, off the little town of Sluys on the coast of Flanders. The fleet lay in the estuary of the river Ede. Like Damme, Sluys has now become an inland village. Its name means the sluice, and like Damme reminds us how the people of the Netherlands have for centuries been winning their land from the sea by their great system of dams to keep the sea water back, and sluices to carry the river water to the sea. The estuary of the Ede, where the French fleet anchored, is now pasture land traversed by a canal, and the embankments that keep the sea from the meadowlands lie some miles to the westward of the place where King Edward won his great naval victory. Had the French acted at once, there was nothing to prevent them from opening the war by invading England. Perhaps they did not know how slowly the English fleet was assembling. In the late spring, when the French armament was nearly complete, King Edward had only 40 ships ready. They lay in the estuaries of the Orwell and the Stour, inside Harwich, long a place of importance for English naval wars in the North Sea. Gradually, week after week, other ships came in from the Thames and the northern seaports, from